I still get emotional when I talk about it. The ability to work on something that motivated you at that level was just too attractive. Investors will look at this and say, you got that measurement, so what?
Steve Axelrod is a particle physicist turned Silicon Valley CEO who's made a career out of pulling the signal from the noise. Today, he leads GTech Medical, a startup using wearable patches to measure electrical signals from the gut, a kind of EKG for the stomach, offering a new way to track digestive function without scopes or scans. Steve's also a parent, and as you'll hear in this episode, the company's mission is deeply tied to his experience as a dad. His daughter was GTech's first test subject, and now she helps run the company alongside him. We talked about why gastrointestinal issues are so hard to measure, something called a gut beat, and how GTech's data could change how doctors diagnose, understand, and treat conditions in the abdomen. Well, Steve, thank you so much for being here today. I can't tell you how excited I am to unpack your story with you.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you for inviting me. It's a real honor to be invited to be on a podcast.
Steve, I think you were the only Silicon Valley CEO that I'm aware of who is also a particle physicist. And when you began your career with your PhD work at Yale, what were you thinking you would spend your life doing at that point?
I wanted to be a scientist. Particle physics was the most exciting thing. It was the sexiest thing for sure. Giant accelerators slamming things into each other at billions or even trillions of volts. So I thought this would be fun to do for my career. And then reality hit that if you want to stay at a great place like Yale or Stanford, there's too many people not retiring that are in your way to get, a job at a place like that. And so I decided to go to local industry instead.
And I know this is a big jump, but you are working in sensors now. Are there any common themes that kind of unify work and sensors?
I wouldn't call work in sensors so much as just measurement, right? So really every physicist learns how to measure things. That's what we do. We design experiments to give us information that we think will help us better understand the universe, because that's really what the job is for a physicist, in research at least. Go out there and better understand the universe. And so we design experiments and we make measurements, and then we take those measurements and we analyze them and look for things that show commonalities and processes and underlying connections. And then we try and use that information to tell us something about the universe.
How did you come to work at GTech?
So there was an intermediate step. So Measurex was bought by Honeywell, and that was good for a while. I got promoted and I was eventually director of the measurements group, basically hardware engineering. And then they decided that it was too expensive to have this big group of physicists and engineers in Silicon Valley. It would be cheaper to do it overseas. And so I laid off my group, then laid off myself, and started looking around for another job. And I'd always wanted to be in the medical device space if I couldn't be in pure physics. And I was lucky enough to find a job at a company called Zoft Microtube. But I had to go back to being just a bench scientist again, not the director of 30 people. But it was well worth it. And I had a blast. And then I think it was 2003 or so, 2008 rather. And then there was a big downturn and most of the company got laid off and they sold the company. As often happens with startups, the company was sold for a small fraction of the amount of money had been invested. But the technology lives on. So it's being used in breast cancer treatment. It's being used for skin cancers, which is the last project that I worked on. And it's being used for endometrial or vaginal cancers as well. So that was exciting. And it was my first introduction to doing something that helped people directly. We were helping people who had breast cancer. And I have 2 daughters, and they were young at the time. And they were much more proud of their dad than.
I've often heard people talking about working in a MedTech environment for the first time and sort of noticing a different hop in the step of people that they're around, and this kind of feeling that there's a different kind of mission than a non-human oriented company.
Yeah, I still get emotional when I talk about it. When I remember we had a holiday dinner at the company after we had treated our first patient. Well, years into it, I was there for I think 5.5 years, and she spoke, and everyone was bawling.
It sounds like from hearing you share the story that this was kind of a change in wanting to work in sort of human-oriented technologies. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. Once I tasted that, that's all I was going to do, right? So once I worked in the medical device space, I knew that I wouldn't go back to something like an industrial job, even if it was, exciting from a purely technical viewpoint. The ability to work on something that motivated you at that level was just too attractive. That's what I was going to work on for the rest of my career.
I'd love to know what the original vision was when you first got started working in your current company. What you saw in that company that excited you.
So the idea was that we were going to be able to make some measurements of the gastrointestinal tract using
And this is GTech, by
this
the
is
way, just
G-Tech
to
Medical, right? Make measurements of the gastrointestinal tract's function completely non-invasively. My younger daughter, Lindsay, at the age of 13, was diagnosed, actually came down suddenly with Crohn's disease. She got very sick very quickly. We were off at a tournament. She was a softball, but both my daughters played softball very well. So we were off at this big tournament in New Mexico, and she got very sick and couldn't play. We were there for 4 or 5 days. She wound up having bloody diarrhea multiple times, 2 trips in the emergency room, didn't know how we would make it back on a plane flight. Got back home, and took them 3 weeks to diagnose her with Crohn's disease, because there are so many other things that can lead to GI problems, stomach pain, diarrhea, and even bloody diarrhea. It could just be an infection. So I learned that the state of diagnosis in the GI world is not as good as you would like it to be, right? Not because people aren't smart. It's so complicated.
There's so many things that we diagnose today in medicine that I imagine in the future we will be horrified that we do. You mean you had to cut a piece of someone's body out to tell them what was wrong with them, and so many things that we do now that just feel like, well, that's how you do it. And I imagine a Crohn's diagnosis is a lot to go through as a patient, or getting to the diagnosis, I guess I should say.
Yeah. So my wife took Lindsay to a pediatric gastroenterologist who did an upper endoscopy and a colonoscopy, and told us that she wasn't going home. She was going to be in the hospital for the next 2 weeks at least. It wound up being 3 weeks. So for 3 weeks, I slept on an air mattress. Went to work during the day. My wife spent the days with her. And it was very, very scary.
And I imagine this must have been really resonant for you when you started to learn about GTech and what they were building, and thinking back on Lindsay and your family.
Yeah. So when I joined GTech, it was just an idea. And I was brought in as the CEO, and essentially took over, treated it just like one of the other product development, measurement development problems. I didn't know anything about GI, and I didn't even know the other work that people were doing. It turned out that 100 years earlier, someone had measured signals from the stomach electrically, an analogy to the first EKG. So the EKG was now over 100 years ago, and not much after that, someone put electrodes on the stomach and measured that there is actually a signal coming from the stomach. But I didn't know that, and so I kind of reinvented it.
It's such an interesting pattern in so many medtech companies' breakthroughs, where there's this early insight, and then you dig back in the literature and the dusty journals that never even made it into digital form, and you find that someone had that idea and tried it out, and maybe it got lost to history because the technology just wasn't there to take it further. And it sounds like in your case, not only the technology wasn't there, but you have developed a new way of thinking about that signal.
Yeah, so there was, as you mentioned, there was actually a commercial product. Several companies made a version of it called EKG, or electrogastrography. And the originators there were the 3 CPM corp, and they're called 3 CPM because CPM stands for cycles per minute. And 3 cycles per minute is the frequency that your stomach contracts at after you eat or whenever it needs to process food. So there's these interstitial cells of Cajal that set up what you might think of as some sort of an FM carrier wave, or they call it a slow wave. And that triggers the muscle cells in the stomach to contract, coordinate, and do the peristalsis, or the segmentation. If you think about the intestines rather than the stomach, the intestines don't just propel things in peristalsis. Most of the time, they're moving things back and forth so that you can do digestion, right? And all that is controlled by these ICC, or interstitial cells of Cajal, that is set at particular frequencies. And that is just really lucky for us. So there are some things that are really lucky for us in what we're doing now that nature just gave us a gift, right? The fact that there are these rhythmic control signals lets us see a signal that's like a millivolt or a few millivolts and separated from all the noise that's coming from a patch that you're wearing on your stomach that is actually much closer to your stomach abdominal wall muscles than it is to your organs, right? So it's only because those signals occur over and over the same frequency that you can do frequency analysis and increase your signal to noise ratio. We're lucky that those signals are there at all. Just like an EKG. In EKG, you pick up the signals from the heart at the skin surface. Now those are much bigger signals, 10 times, multiples of 10 times bigger than what we're looking for. And they're much simpler too. It's the same thing over and over, right? But why is that signal there? Well, it's just because of the way muscle cells work, and they use these, if it's calcium and sodium or calcium to potassium channels, do the electrical work that engages things, but a certain amount of that current just leaks out of the cell, and it could leak all the way to the skin surface. And just lucky it happens to be there, lucky that it happens to be different to the stomach, the small intestine, the colon, for us to be able to tell them apart.
It's so fascinating. And well, I want to hit pause on this, and I want to come back to these signals in a second. But for someone who's listening and learning about your technology for the first time and hearing about this really deeply rooted family connection that you have, can you walk through why being able to sense signals and sense rhythms in someone's GI tract, whether it's the stomach or their colon or the small bowel, how that connects to someone's illness, and what the vision is and the promise is of being able to do that reliably, that gets you and gets, frankly, your investors so excited?
Yeah, and David, you put it so nicely. Can you walk us through why this is so important? Investors will look at this and say, you got that measurement, so what? Right? This is the famous so what question that every MedTech entrepreneur deals with all the time. So what good is it? So we just step back a little bit and we think about gastrointestinal disorders. They have just a small number of symptoms, really. There's maybe 100 different sources of disorders of the GI tract. They can be anatomic or they can be functional. So an anatomic thing would be something like you have a tumor, you have cancer, you have a blockage, something in your intestine is twisted. There's a fistula, there's a leaky gut or something. Those are anatomic, and you can see those with a CT scan or maybe an ultrasound or a colonoscopy. Like all these ways.
Almost mechanical things that interrupt the normal flow.
Exactly right. And then there's functional problems. Most people who go to the doctor for one of those symptoms, constipation, diarrhea, chronic abdominal pain, bloating, nausea, things like that, really just a little over a handful of common symptoms that can come from so many different causes. Most of them don't have cancer, thank goodness. Most of them don't have a blockage or a fistula. Most of them have a functional disorder. Everything looks fine when you look at it mechanically, but it isn't working fine. How do you measure that? How do you measure function? Right? A CT scan measures anatomy very precisely. To take a colonoscopy, go inside, you can see things beautifully. In a Crohn's patient, or ulcerative colitis patient, you'll see that they have ulceration. You'll see that maybe open sores there, so you can diagnose that. But if you take something like IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, that's not a disease, that's a definition, right? Gastroparesis and functional dyspepsia are mostly definitions, or else it's defined on the basis of the test that exists getting a result in the lowest 20 percentile and you have gastroparesis, right? It isn't like a disease that you can diagnose by finding a virus or a bacteria or identifying a torn ligament or a broken bone. And this underscores why it's so hard for gastroenterologists to figure out what's going on. Every one of them is a Sherlock Holmes in what they try to do to take all these disparate clues and figure out what's the right way to treat this patient to help them with their symptoms. So getting back to so what, right? Why is it that what we're doing in measuring these electrical signals is useful? That's because by looking at the strength of those electrical signals that come from this rhythmic activity over long periods, over the whole day, through the full diurnal cycle, and then for multiple days to get some sort of sense of the reproducibility and get more accurate averages, we're able to tell the gastroenterologist the performance in their patient's gut. By gut, I mean the stomach, small intestine, and colon. Be able to say, your stomach was in a normal level of activity compared to healthy controls, the same for the small intestine, for the colon, or it's not. For a patient, perhaps, who's complaining of bloating and nausea, perhaps their stomach activity is well below average, say in the 10th percentile, or maybe it's at the 90th percentile, right? Same thing for the other organs. And now the doctor can say, okay, your small intestine, your colon look pretty normal, but your stomach's at some very low level of activity. It's a good chance that that's why you feel bloated all the time. So let's look at that. Or the inverse of that, a person with constipation, is their colon working right? Well, the colon could be very low activity and that may lead to constipation, but it could be at very high activity and also have constipation because it's not coordinated. That we call peristalsis is a very coordinated propulsive action from one site to the next, right? If you have a lot of activity, but it isn't well coordinated, you could also have everything getting stopped up and not being pushed through. Now think for a moment about you as a doctor. If you hear the patient has constipation and you don't have this kind of information, you may say, well, I'm going to give them a stimulant for the colon. Well, what if your colon was already, overly active? That wouldn't be effective, but it could also be very painful, right? So with our information, being able to let the physician, the gastroenterologist, for the first time, really have a map of how the stomach and the small intestine and the colon are working, we feel that they will be able to be much more well-informed and be able to target their therapy much better than if they were lacking that information.
Your daughter, who I should just mention for our listeners, now runs the company with you and one other employee, speaks publicly about the fact that patients don't always have their symptoms when they're in front of the doctor. And I think this is such a universal experience for patients and for doctors, where someone will come in and say, look, you're going to think I'm crazy. I feel fine now, but this is what I felt, or this is what I felt before. And it's often a real dilemma for everybody and sort of how to respond when someone has a history of these sensations and things that are bothersome, but maybe not in the exact moment and that one brief moment that they're in front of the doctor. And this really seems to be captured by what you're describing with some of these signals. Could you say a little bit more about how that plugs into the vision of where you might be able to take GTech?
Yeah. So Lindsay does talk, as you said, about how you can be in flare and not feel it, or conversely, not be in flare according to the ways they measure it now, but feel really bad. So she had an example, I think a year or two, she was feeling she's in flare. And if she feels like she's in flare, you got to say she's in flare, right? What else is the use of the word? But she got a colonoscopy and they said, no inflammation there. So how do you handle that? How do you categorize it, right? So there's various words that they talk about, but it's just so true in the GI space in general that patients have symptoms, even non-Crohn's patients. In Crohn's, you really can find something that's wrong. It's that inflammation. in the colon and even in the small intestine and Crohn's. But patients who are having IBS symptoms, they don't always have them when they go to the doctor's office. Everything is different, right? So one of the things that we've thought was really important in our system is to be able to not just monitor a patient in the doctor's office for an hour-long test or a 4-hour-long test, but to monitor them at home over at least a full day and preferably multiple days. So we are catching them under realistic physiological conditions. And when they're at home eating the foods that have given rise to their symptoms, not some test meal in the test that's done in a doctor's office. So we just submitted another paper with Dr. Brian Lacey of the Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville just last week. And we did simultaneous gastric emptying scintigraphy tests and started our multiple day, 6-day test. The interesting thing is, if you look at the 4-hour test when they're in the doctor's office and are eating their radioactive eggs and standing in front of a gamma camera, which maybe took them 3 months to schedule that test, and they had to drive 3 hours to get to the Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville, we compared our results to the gastric emptying scintigraphy test. And what we're publishing now is showing that if you look at day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, and you take all the patients in the study, which is about 40-something patients, on day 1, everyone pretty much had a lower amount of activity in their stomach than they did on day 3, 4, and 5. And it was something like 30% lower. Now, why is that? Because they eat this small test meal, because they fasted beforehand? Could be a little bit, but I think it's mostly the white coat effect, just being there. And it's this beautiful graph, the clustering of the patients compared to their average. And you just see these data points. Here's the average. And then the first day it's down here, and the second day is most of the way up. And the rest of the days, it's plateaued. And so what does that say? Just thinking about it as a measurement physicist, so on average, you're underestimating the person's stomach activity by 30% when you do this test, and you don't know it. No one's ever known that because there's never any way to, measure it the way we can.
Steve, can you speak to, so you just mentioned measuring stomach activity. It seems to me as an observer that you are sitting on a technology now that could be a real paradigm shift for the way that people on the doctor side, how we think about different parts of the abdomen and the intestine, the small bowel. And I'm so curious which direction you are thinking about going from here as you start to refine, active, not active as a signal, but to start to become more nuanced in what you choose to diagnose. I think about the post-op patient who has ileus. We sometimes describe it as like the sleepy stomach to our patients. And I saw Anand spoken about a post-Whipple procedure ileus in some of your conversations. We're talking about gastric dysmotility now. We've been speaking about Crohn's earlier and sensing a Crohn's flare. Are there specific pillars and sectors that you have started to target as your next step to show how the signal can connect to specific diagnoses, or am I thinking about this the wrong way?
So just the last part of your question, you say specific pillars. I assume you mean like specific indications for use?
Well, less indications for use and more the type of information that that a doctor might use this for, to say you have an ileus, or even better, your ileus is about to resolve and we can start giving you food today instead of waiting 3 days, or to someone with Crohn's and say, you know what, you actually may feel totally fine, but it looks like your flare is going to start developing, and in a couple days you might start feeling symptoms, and let's make a change to your biologic today. It feels like there are so many different clinical scenarios, so many different ways that we might draw information from these broad signals that you're able to detect. So I'm curious which directions you are most excited about taking that first.
So I would have to bring it back to the indications for use and how the information is common amongst them all, including the indication that you just brought up, which is from the different one, patients who are recovering from abdominal surgery, right, in the post-op ileus. So after patients had abdominal surgery, the gut shuts down, not just the stomach, but the small intestine and the colon. And the thing that keeps the patient in the hospital, as you know better than me, because of your professional background, is when is primarily the colon ready? Uh, when is it active? And when can you feel safe sending the patient home? And right now, there's no way to know that other than asking the patient if they feel ready to eat, if they've eaten, if maybe they've passed some gas or maybe had bowel movement, but all those are subjective and inferential. Whereas with our system, we're actually measuring this myoelectrical activity that tells us that there are contractions going on in those organs. There is this traditional information that the small intestine starts up on day one, maybe after 8 hours, the stomach after 24 hours, and the colon after 2 to 3 days. Do you know that every time you see that referred to in a paper, it goes back to a 1971 study published in 1972? And that was a study, it was done very, very well for that time period. But they gave people barium and they took x-rays of them after surgery. And they took a couple x-rays hours apart or a day apart. And all that information, this came from a few point in time measurements. So there was no granularity to the measurements. It wasn't like every hour they had a measurement. It was at, day one, day two, and maybe day three if the patient was still in the hospital. So with our system, you have this continuous indication of how much activity there has been in each of those organs. And so you're able to determine that you've reached a threshold where it's safe to feed that patient, and then assuming they tolerate it, to send them home. And by the way, because of the way our system is designed, you don't need to take the patches off. You can send them home still wearing the patches. And why would you want to do that? Because readmissions are a bad thing, as you know. And the second most common cause for readmission after surgical site infection is ileus. And so why do people develop ileus when they go home? Well, what I've been told is that once they're home and their spouse wants some help around the house and isn't as kind to them as the nursing staff, they have a lot of pain and they start taking pain medications. And what do the pain medications do? They shut everything down again. So they redevelop an ileus. But if we're able to monitor it, maybe you catch it a little bit sooner. The things are slowing down, and before it becomes extreme enough for them to be readmitted, you can help them manage the situation. So that's the post-op side of things. That's 10% of the opportunity for use of the gut tracker system. The rest is all in GI disorders. So that's gastroparesis and functional dyspepsia, the chronic nausea and vomiting, the four gut issues. It's irritable bowel syndrome. It's Crohn's and colitis. It's chronic constipation, diarrhea. And those all have this common source that it's connected to the function of the gut. And these are all people who have what they used to call functional issues, but now they want to call disorders of the gut-brain interface. Everything looks fine. It just isn't working fine. So if you can measure how it's working by looking at these myoelectrical signals, you have armed yourself with information that can, I'll go back to the same term used before, help you better target your therapies, knowing where it's localized and the nature of that. Is it hyper or hypoactive, or is it dysrhythmic or something else?
One question that I'm thinking about hearing this is whether you are at the point where there's a unique signature that you are starting to identify for these different parts of the gut, and to break that down a step further, if there's a unique signature for different pathological states that the gut can be in.
Yeah, so that too is another great question. So where are we? So as you know, we're early. We've done about 1,000 tests so far. We've published 8 papers and have 2 that are in review right now. So given the broad applicability, we're just scratching the surface. But there's 2 indications that I think we do have a good handle on things. And one is this gastroparesis syndrome, or chronic nausea and vomiting, where essentially it's bloating and distension, and chronic nausea and vomiting are key symptoms. In that case, patients ultimately are diagnosed with gastroparesis if they've gone through a whole bunch of tests and arrived at a place like Mayo Clinic or Cleveland Clinic or Stanford, where they have access to the technology, the gamma camera that lets them do a gastric emptying scintigraphy test, the one with the radioactive eggs. When you have that test, if you come back with slow emptying, which is the equivalent of us saying you have low activity, roughly equivalent, then you have gastroparesis. And if you don't have it, then pretty much you have functional dyspepsia. And there are guidelines on how to treat those. So for us, if we can simply say much earlier in the diagnostic journey, maybe the first test that a patient undergoes, that, hey, look, your stomach is at the 10th percentile compared to healthy cohort. You're going to go through all these other tests and have a gastric emptying scintigraphy test in 6 or 12 months. That's going to come back slow emptying, and they're going to treat you for gastroparesis. We can tell you that now with a non-invasive, user-friendly test. Conversely, we'll say, no, that's not your trouble. There is an influential younger doctor, on his way to being a key opinion leader, or KOL, at Harvard. And he said, I think from your test, the most interesting result I could get would be everything comes back normal. That stomach, small intestine, colon are all in the normal range. Because then I'd know that it's not a motility or a function problem. Then I'd go on to look elsewhere. That would be the most interesting result. And that was interesting to hear, because I always thought, well, you just want something that tells you what to do. And he said, yeah, it tells me what to do, but it just in a much more sophisticated sense than you're thinking of, Steve, because you're just a physicist.
Steve, do you want to show us your patch?
Sure. So here it is. So completely wireless electrode patch. So this is the top side that one will see. I know it looks really big, bigger than my head, but it's not. It's only 3 inches or so. And the bottom side is a bunch of electrodes. So there's actually 9 electrodes. One's a ground electrode, and then there's 4 pairs. See, these are all bipolar pairs. So that's a pair, that's a pair. And so we get 4 signals from each patch, and you would wear 3 patches. There'd be 2 that would be above your belly button, and then 1 below the belly button. So they're thin and light. They conform to your body well. Miraculously, they stay on the body, even though on your abdomen, it's a very hard place to keep a patch because it folds so much. And of course, some people are concave and some people are convex. And so it has to deal with that. But they let you go about your normal daily life. And if you take care of them, they will last at least for the 6 days. We've had someone go for 16 days recently. And so they just are connected by Bluetooth to your phone. There's an app on the phone that collects the data and sends it up to the cloud, all secure, all HIPAA compliant. They just continuously stream the data, goes up to the cloud, and we get 30 million data points and do a bunch of magic based on my particle physics background, and are able to provide the report to the physician.
Because you mentioned data, there's a question that I want to ask you that is, it's going to sound weird, so I want you to bear with me here. But I'm so fascinated by the analogy to the EKG for this one reason that is separate from the obvious sort of measuring signals. Generations of med students now learn to understand EKGs, and they learn to understand when they see a squiggly line, for lack of a better description, when they see a line going this way, they have a direct understanding of electrically where the deflection is happening, where the current is moving through the septum, where there is left ventricular hypertrophy, all based on these different electrical changes that they can see immediately happening on paper. And then I think of other forms of data, like, for instance, data that goes through an algorithm and you're told you have X, Y, Z, but we may not see the data. And then stuff somewhere in between where you have the humble digital blood pressure cuff, like in the ICU or the hospital, where we see a blood pressure number, but there's actually this hidden algorithm that's happening inside the machine that we don't even know, where we just see the cuff inflating and deflate, and then we see 140/88, and that seems very mechanical and direct. But actually, there's this algorithm below the surface. So this long preamble that I have is I'm so curious how you have thought about one day when this is a mainstream technology that is applied in the hospital post-op before discharge in the office for patients. What do you envision being the thing that the clinician sees? Is it some form of the data? Is it just a report and it's been sort of processed in the background by your company, or is that yet to be determined?
Well, we do have a patient report. I want to back up a little bit because I want to express my jealousness at the people who are doing EKGs because it's so much easier. There's just the same signal, and as long as it happens every second, so you get another one the next second, and then there's just a bunch of versions of it that are wrong, right? Atrial fibrillation, or you have names for all of them, and it is pretty straightforward to be able to see those on charts and figure out what they mean. In the case of the gut, it's just so much more complicated. We've coined the term gut beat, and like heartbeat, which is the repetition time, it's 24 hours. If I make a measurement of you for an hour, the next hour is different, or 4 hours, the next 4 hours are different. The only period of time, the shortest period of time which repeats, is 24 hours. So that's why we argue how important it is to do a test for 24 hours. But getting back to what you asked me, which is how we show the data, because we have 30 million data points, we have got to do a tremendous amount of processing. I'm using my background in particle physics to come up with an approach that I think any particle physicist would come up with. But we try to reduce it to a way that is very easy to interpret. So being here in Silicon Valley, we've been steeped in the concept of user-friendliness. So we've made the patches so they're user-friendly, and patients can wear them at home and take showers and even do light exercise. And we try to make the system easy for the staff in the doctor's office to get the test started. And we try to make it easy, similarly, for the physician to interpret. So the first thing you will see as a physician, the 30 million data points will be reduced to 3 numbers. And that will be the relative activity level of the patient's stomach, small intestine, and colon, just like the percentiles in an SAT test or like a blood panel. It's in the normal range. It's a little on the high side. It's very on the high side, very on the low side, something like that. That's the first thing we see. And then you'll start seeing things a little more sophisticated, like the response to meals, postprandial response, because that's also information. The dysrhythmia, how consistent is the frequency? What's the repeatability from day to day? So that's what's in our report now. And, as time goes by, there will be more, and there will be things that are tailored toward certain types of indications for use. For example, with a patient with a chronic disease like Crohn's or colitis, there will be information showing the history of that patient to the physician.
Steve, I look back in your career, and you have done so many really fascinating things, and so many of them seem like a really complicated way of what we call pulling signal from noise. And I wonder, one day when you are done with GTech, or you hand it off, or whatever comes next, how do you want to be remembered for everything that you've been doing?
Well, that's a deep question, right? Not as a technologist or as, someone who spent their career making measurements, but as someone who contributed to NACOM. And this is always hard for me to talk about, right? Because I get emotional at this, the family connection. But what's the meaning of my life unless my career, I should say, unless I've contributed in some way? So if we at GTech, not just me, but the whole team of people and all the advisors and consultants that we've used, if we deliver something that physicians use, especially as first line when a patient first shows up with these symptoms, and just puts the patch on them and comes up with better clues that help them get to better outcomes faster and easier for the patient, I want to be known as someone who played a role in that.
That's beautiful. Thank you. One last question. You are at a point where I'm sure there's so many people that would love to ask your advice and may already be doing so. How do you advise someone that's at the very start of their career that knows they want to make a difference, knows they want to work in health tech, and that's it, doesn't even have a problem that they're working on yet?
I would say don't target a role so much. Like, I want to be a CEO, or I want to be an entrepreneur and come up with an idea. I'm more thinking you should just get into the field and see what happens. Maybe you'll rise up to be a director or a VP or a CEO. Probably not, because it's a small fraction of people. Maybe you'll wind up being in a field where you get an idea that is something that can be turned into a company, but that is extraordinarily rare. Put those things, in your goals and objectives. Just try to make a great career out of contributing, because otherwise I think most people are going to be disappointed. I know that you're part of BioDesign, which is a fabulous program, and it teaches everyone to do assessment of needs before creating some piece of hardware or software. And that's great advice. I believe it's right 80 to 90% of the time. But as a physicist, as a technologist, I believe that the really big breakthroughs come the other direction, where you've come up with a technology, you've come up with something where now I have this little microprocessor that I can put on a patch, and Apple has come out with the iPhone 4S that has Bluetooth in it, and I can now create a patch that just talks to my own phone, right? So there's a class of new technologies that are the breakthroughs that are more likely to come from even a technology first approach. So don't give up on that and go purely needs-based. The needs-based is right most of the time, but where did the MRI come from, and where did CT scanning come from? Not because someone said that, well, we need to see inside the body more accurately, so I'm going to think about magnetic resonance imaging. It just didn't happen, right? So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but
Absolutely, it does. Steve, where can people go to learn more about you and what you do online?
I guess www.gtechmedical.com. We've revamped the website. There's actually quite a bit of good information there, including copies of our papers and all. And there's info@gtechmedical.com, and I will see that if someone writes to it.
Well, Steve, thank you so much. This has been such a treat to talk to you today.
Well, thank you so much, David. And again, I'm really honored to be part of it. And, you do such a great job that it really was fun to be part of it.
Oh, thank you.